So today, the Bureau of Labor releasing the October employment report, and for the most part, it was impressive, but there were some glaring red flags. Now, the good news is that hundreds of thousands of Americans returned to the labor force, and the private sector created enough jobs to absorb all of them. The bad news, over 15 million Americans shut out, and I mentioned this earlier, either their employer is out of business or restricted from hiring. Additionally, long-term unemployment surged more than almost 50%, 3.6 million people. So the question is how to best help those Americans. Now, some say fewer restrictions on business, while others say things like higher minimum wage. And others say, well, that still doesn't go far enough. We need something like universal basic income. My next guests, I think, both are very thoughtful people, but with different ideas on how to best help. For more, Gravity Payment CEO Dan Price, along with National Taxpayers Union Senior Fellow Mattie Duppler. Mattie, let me start with you. I really thought that the folks in Florida really set the tone here, because they overwhelmingly voted for higher minimum wage, and at the same time they voted for Trump as a rebuke of giving everything away. So to me it feels like you can't argue that these voters are cold-hearted because they wanted to help their fellow man or woman, but at the same token they draw the line, I think, on things like universal basic income. Where do you come down on this?
Well, look at the data that we have from over the summer, Charles. If support intended to help workers in the form of a UBI, universal basic income, or an increased minimum wage really worked, we wouldn't have seen the most explosive job growth coming out of the coronavirus lockdowns in the summer months, when we saw unemployment benefits supporting workers at a tune of maybe 150% of what they were making prior to going on unemployment. I think that dispels the notion that having artificial means in place to try and pay workers more is the wrong way to go about trying to increase the wealth and worker welfare in this country. And, you look at the course of the recovery over the past several months, the American resiliency has been on display here, both in the terms of job creators being able to figure out how to stay online despite different precautions in place to try and keep the COVID situation at bay, but also workers being pulled back in once they were trying to, once they were laid off, going back off of temporary layoff. I think that demonstrates that there's an elasticity here that American employers and workers have figured out.
Dan?
Well, I'm in the trenches serving 20,000 small businesses every day. And so I think the American people have figured out that the power balance between corporations and regular people, which I would describe as basically small businesses, workers, and consumers, is out of whack. So while Americans are understandably skeptical of centralized power, we want any policies that we can have that will eliminate that gap between the little folks and the people on top. UBI and minimum wage will help us do that.
Yeah, but there is a bridge between higher minimum wage, $15 an hour, and UBI, where you're essentially paying people whether they work or not, whether they're even seeking work or not.
Yeah, and I would say one thing that conservatives have pointed out to me all the time is UBI is a check on too much government expansion, because when you have the government sending a check to everyday people, maybe that's one more program that you don't need. Now, it's not a reason to eliminate the most essential programs that we absolutely need, but at some point it's putting money into the hands of everyday people and trusting them to do the right thing. I myself, when I raised to a $70,000 minimum wage the salary of the people that work at Gravity Payments, I myself was derided as a socialist. But what did we see afterwards? People started having babies, buying homes, paying down debt. They got healthier. Multiple people lost 100 pounds, beat cancer. These things really work.
Mattie, is that the best way to address the stubbornness of some of the upward mobility issues that some have, particularly in this environment? Or is there something better? Because it just sounds too good to be true. Write unlimited checks to people and we all live happily ever after.
That's right. You know what Dan is describing, I want for every worker in this country, $70,000 guaranteed a year so they can raise their families and take care of people who are sick. That sounds great to me. The way you get there is by removing barriers to work. And the way you get there is not by raising the minimum wage. I, too, believe that if we could have more of a conversation about how we raise wages, workers would be better off. But what we know is from in places where you've raised the minimum wage artificially, you get people who are suffering the most as a result of that. In Seattle, which I think is where Dan is based, University of Washington said when the minimum wage was raised there, workers' hours were cut, which was akin to $125 less in their paycheck every single week. The minimum wage worker, your typical service worker, can't afford that kind of pay cut. So when you're looking at ways to get the economy back on track, look no further than a year ago, where American household was the highest it's been on record because of a decrease in regulation, a decrease in the tax burden, and allowing companies to reward their workers by putting their investment back into where it matters most, and that's the workers' bottom line.
Mattie, Dan, I'm sure we'll continue this conversation at a different time. We're out of time, Dan. I'm sorry. But we'll pick it up again because it's an important issue, particularly as we have millions of people who are still struggling in this lockdown environment. Meanwhile, Republican women seeing record-breaking success in the House. Coming up, New York